Herzlich willkommen, meine Damen und Herren, herzlich
Dear
willkommen
ladies and
zu dieser
gentlemen, I wish you a
Veranstaltung
warm
der Hessischen
welcome.
Landesvertretung in
Welcome to
Brüssel
the event of
der
the
Europäischen Union. Mein Name ist Detlef Fechtner, ich bin stellvertretender Chefredakteur der Börsenzeitung.
permanent representation of the state of Hesse in Brussels. My name is Dr. Detlef Fechtner, and I'm glad to lead you through the discussion together with Prof Dr Joachim Wuermeling. Before we start, some information. We want to talk with you. We don't want to make simple presentations, so we would like to get you actively involved in our event. Now you can see the different ways how you can contact us. We have our phone number, and then we have the streamline lv brussels.hessen.de. Then you have the phone number 320472030181. You can send us your questions, remarks, and whatever. Before we start, we would like to give the word to our Minister, the Minister for Federal and European Affairs of the State of Hessen, Ms. Lucia Puttrich. Mr. Puttrich, it's up to you. Dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a new edition of our series Europe Debates. Europe facing a new banking crisis? This is the question we want to debate today. We are in the heart of the corona pandemic, and we see that the economy is suffering. We see sales dwindling. We had to see that retail industry had to close. Supply chains are broken. The travel industry had come to a standstill, and so on. Then we had sectors which were doing surprisingly well, like the e-commerce. Okay, there are many differences in the European Union and within the economy. What will this mean for us for the future? What will this mean for our economy? And what will this mean for the financial market? Both cannot be separated from each other. We cannot split the economy from the financial sector. And if the economy is dwindling, this also has an impact on the financial market. If banks are suffering, if they get weaker and weaker, so what have we learned from 2008? In 2008, we have learned that we had to hedge better the financial risk, that banks would need equity. And we also see that if the states incur debts, this has also consequences. What about the borrowing capacity of banks? What about bonds? Are bonds an attractive investment, or is this finished? We have one expert today. It's Professor Dr. Wuermeling, and I'm very glad to welcome you today. He's really an expert on this topic, and he can say something about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the economy, but also on the financial market. So I wish you a warm welcome, and I'm sure we'll have a very interesting event. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Minister Puttrich. Now we will start in media res, and we will start with a keynote speech from Professor Dr. Joachim Wuermeling, who will be at our panel later on. Mr. Wuermeling, you are born in Münster, and then you went to school in Limburg, where you did your Abitur. You studied or made law studies in Bayreuth and in Florence, and you were really involved in our topic. In the topic, the consequences of Corona. Is Europe facing a new banking crisis? You know all about banks. You know all about crisis. And if I may say so, you have been experiencing different moments, different phases, and you have been working at the Bavarian Staatskanzlei for Europe. Then you came to the European Parliament as member of the Parliament. Then you had been State Secretary for European Affairs under Michael Kloos. You have also been on the other side, if I may say so. You have been member of the direction of the insurance industry in Germany. You have been board member of the Sparda Bank, so you know the credit business very well. 2016, you came to the German Bundesbank, where you are working on risk controlling, IT, and banking supervision, which are really three topics very close to our topic of today. And so we are really glad to welcome you today here. And I repeat the topic of today: consequence of Corona is Europe facing a new banking crisis. And now you got the word. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Fechtner. Thank you very much, Ms. Puttrich. Yes, ladies and gentlemen. Initially, I was supposed to talk about Basel III, the regulation standards today, but given the consequences of Corona on the banks, the Basel Committee and the European Commission have decided to defer the implementation of the Basel III package. So there has been a deferral, but we are facing a much more complicated topic, which is or are the consequences of Corona on the banking crisis. And there we have the first question: will the economic crisis convert into a financial crisis? So thank you very much for your invitation, and thank you very much for the interest, many applications, many participants. So this is really an indicator showing that people want to exchange on this topic, even if we cannot be together in one room at your state representation, but we can do it in an online way. And this also shows that the uncertainty regarding our today's topic is quite large. I cannot promise you to eliminate all these uncertainties. I am currently at the guest house at the Bundesbank in Frankfurt, where Vice President Buch and I have been presenting our stability report, and we had to admit that we are still in a phase of uncertainty, and therefore it is very difficult to make clear outlooks, to give clear outlooks. I'm very happy to exchange with you on this topic, and I would first like to address three different topics. What are the reflects of an economic crisis in the financial sector? Then, what about the credit crisis regarding Corona? And third question, how our banking system will change in the medium and in the long term due to this crisis. Dear ladies and gentlemen, first question. A classic economic crisis has its impact on the banking sector a little later. If we have insolvencies of companies, if credits cannot be reimbursed, only then this has an impact on the balance sheets of the banks. Therefore, it is not astonishing that until now we don't have a really measurable impact regarding the non-paid credits. So there will be a few more months to go, but we will see this impact later on. For the moment, we have lots of analysis from consulting companies, from experts, trying to estimate the final number of unpaid credits. And depending on the method, depending on the approach, the results are different. But there is one thing in common. Modulation is difficult since we cannot compare the Corona crisis with crises from the past. It was a really fast arriving crisis, worldwide crisis, that arrived at the same moment. And the shock has an asymmetric impact on the different economic sectors. Even within one sector, the impact can be very different if we only think at the real estate sector. Okay, so the outlook regarding the aftershock remains vague, since we are not sure about the evolution of the pandemic and not sure about its impact on economy and the banks. So it would be way too early to be relieved. And if we take the numbers of the 21st main German institutes regarding the first semesters, we are only reaching 50% of last year's numbers. And these are the worst numbers in 12 years. So here we are anticipating losses that still not yet occurred. And if we regard the real economy may have reached, is out of the crisis, but nevertheless the crisis in the banking sector is yet to come. So what could be the impact? What about credit risks? Credit risks for the European banking system are very important. Regarding the Eurozone, credits are 62% of the balance sheet of the sector. In Germany, this amounts up to 70%. In addition, insolvencies have been deferred in Germany and in Europe because there's no duty to file an application for insolvency anymore. Therefore, it is not astonishing to not see any indicator showing the real impact that is still to come. And this will only be seen in the medium and in the long term, because we cannot defer insolvencies and credit indeterminately. If we are waiting too long, it will be a kind of congestion, of insolvency congestion. We are talking sometimes about zombie banks or zombie companies. Now, regarding standards and supervision, we should already now prepare an exit plan. Here it is important to find the right balance between mitigating the impacts of the crisis and the necessary cut in order to improve our situation. And dear Mr. Fechtner, I think this will be one of the most difficult tasks for Brussels and Strasbourg during the coming months. As banking supervision, we are really keeping an eye on this situation, and until now we don't see any increasing in difficult credits. During the first semester of 220, it was even dwindling with 0.7%. So we nevertheless have to prepare for an increasing. And this will mainly have an impact on the weak countries that were already struggling before the corona crisis. As I said, tomorrow I could present, together with my colleague Buch, our report, and there the estimation for German says that the correction would amount to 0.8%, which would be comparable to the global financial crisis from 2008, even if many different measures have not yet been integrated in these numbers. The numbers resulting from these percentages are rather low regarding what we have been calculating in our supervisory boards, because we are thinking about the MPA regarding 1.4 billion euros, but the MPLs of 500 billion euros are already integrated in this number. And this is only a annual number. And the baseline scenario, and we only take the baseline scenario, or we use the baseline scenario. We have 3 different scenarios, and you can read the details in our report. Dear ladies and gentlemen, now the question is, how can we use these scenarios? The equity quota, according to us, will go down by 2%. But if this will result in a banking crisis, does not only depend on the magnitude of the shock, but also on the possible resilience. And here we can say that Germany and Europe can handle loan losses. Yes, since the banking crisis, we have seen at European level, at national level, that we have made some buffers in 3-digit billion numbers. Okay, and this is a kind of resilience which is now very positive for our system. So, conclusion: some of our banks could get into trouble, but as a whole, we can say that we could handle the pandemic's impact on our banking systems. This is not only true for the German banking sector, and the ability analysis of the SSM says more or less the same. Very interesting at this point, also if we compare European numbers. Okay, the German banking system is always being criticized as overbanked and not profitable and so on. But this is only one point of view. The other point of view would be that the German banking system really has very good portfolios at its disposal, and that it has huge resilience due to its equity. Okay, and all this is linked, since, of course, less risk means less profitability, which are both sides of one same topic. But in times of crisis, the capacity to be resilient is very important and is paying. So what will be the consequences in the medium and in the long term? Let me first take or show you the point of view of our banks. It's a kind of tree limber for our banking. First of all, the banks have to assure their equity. They have to repair the damages. And, of course, it would not be wrong to handle equity in a very careful way. Second, banks have to give loans, have to continue to give loans, and therefore they should use their buffers. Okay, we need these credits, and this is the economic responsibility of banks. And third point, it continues to be important to use adequate standards when according credits in order to diminish the risks. Banks should not forget the bonity of their customers and the solvency of their customers, and this is really on the short term. And in the medium and in the long term, the strategic thinking will be more important. As before the pandemic, the main challenge will be to increase the solvency in the long run. Now we have the digitization, which exerts additional pressure on the institutes, and the question regarding personnel is coming up again. Now we have the financial needs of the companies, which will come after the crisis. Okay, there will be a fundamental economic structural change, and of course, regarding CO2 emissions, digital transformation will be very important topics, and all this results in a need for equity. The banks will have to answer. Final remark, what does this mean for supervision and for regulation at the EU level? 2 points from my side. Our task will be to make the structural change possible and to support the banks in this change. At the same time, there should be supervision pressure in order to make this change. If we take into account the profitability of all banks, we will have to take unpopular measures. And if now I take your position, of course, you do not want to see different stores and agency closed in your region. Of course, you want to avoid this. Nevertheless, we should make necessary decisions without politicization. Legislation for bank customers must not impede the evolution of profitable banks. All overall in Europe, the structural change in the banking sector is underway. The big banks have been restructuring in a consequent way, and we see the examples of Italy and of Spain. Also the middle-sized banks, and this is something we see every day in our banking supervision, are really changing their business model in order to be profitable, even at lower interest rates. And second point, especially during the crisis, we have seen that a stronger regulation increases the resilience of banks. Okay, the stronger regulation during the financial crisis of 2008 has now made its proof, and therefore we should not flip what we have reached during 2008. Okay, this should not go together with the releasing on the content regarding the corona crisis, because this has also an impact on our international credibility. The German government has reacted in an adequate, rapid way during the corona crisis. There has been a clear focus on the according of credits, and we will keep this focus. This is clear, but we will also say that special measures are for special times. These banking institutes must not be put under pressure by stronger and stricter rules while they are still busy fighting against corona consequences. Therefore, there will be a transition phase in order to allow the banks to rebuild their buffers and to get back to their business as usual. Dear ladies and gentlemen, my conclusion today would be a threatening of the banking sector as a whole is not should not really be expected, is very unlikely, but banks must be prepared to handle the new standards, and they must be prepared to get the balance between special measures and strong regulation in order to maintain a stable and resilient banking system during the next crisis. We must try to assure the sector, and there it makes sense to be prepared for the worst case. Regarding future opportunities, it is even more important to prepare a regulatory framework one can count on. It's not only about the banking regulation in a specific way, but it's also about the monetary union, the digital finance union, and so on, which are being pushed under the German presidency. Also regarding digitization and sustainability, I think that Europe is on a good way. I've been thinking about the digital finance package and its proposal of using modern technologies like the cloud, but in a regulated way. And of course, we are thinking about the taxonomy for climate neutral investments. So, dear ladies and gentlemen, let us take abreast these challenges and let us grasp the chances behind it. I'm looking forward to our discussion. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this keynote speech. You have taken position regarding many different points already. Okay, so really, Basel III you have also touched upon. Now I have lots of questions. First of my questions. A few of what you said. So there's not yet a relief, but we can see that we'll be able to handle it, that the loan losses will be manageable. And as you said, our banking sector, our credit sector has better equity, is more resilient than in 2008. Now, my question would be regarding the vulnerability. Yeah? Okay, so the banking sector is not highly vulnerable. It has its best chances to pass the crisis and to get stronger. But you mentioned some problems. So regarding profitability, old MPL. So in your opinion, when you're talking about these weaker banks, what would be the difficult points?
Der wunde Punkt ist in der Tat nicht, dass man durch aktuelle Wertberichtigungen, Abschreibungen und so weiter.
So the idea is not to deviate, but the idea is that probably it will be difficult afterwards to fill the gaps, and that is because you can only fill a gap with results that you can show. But right now we have very high costs and then very high expectations, and with the digitalization, so right now we just don't have enough to fill these gaps. And a lot of banks at the moment don't have access or just limited access to more capital. So that also then depends on the capital market, and the major banks can't imitate shares. So all of that doesn't really lead to true mobility. It doesn't lead to true advancement for investments in the future. So that's something I worry about. So mostly the long-term results. Yes, okay, so we will talk about the success model and the perspective of the banks, but before that, I would like to talk about the COVID crisis. You were talking about regulations and also relief mechanisms, but in addition to that, you said, if I understood it correctly, that you don't see any additional relief possibilities. So when you're talking about relief measures, what was really helpful? What was helpful for the banks? Was it the financial or the capital relief or on the reporting side? Well, I think the biggest relief for the major banks was that we gave a lot of tips when it comes to financing. So we said there must be a correlation between the credit results and you have to look at the long-term development. So we were able to limit the losses. Otherwise, it would have been difficult for the banks. So I think also for example, the HGB banks, that was the biggest relief. And we also said they can use some buffers. Germany hasn't done that so far, just because they have some maneuver. So we also indicated that they should use the liquidity reserves. I know that a lot of representatives of banks are here today, and I think a lot of these reliefs have helped. So, for example, when it came to the obligation of reporting, we delayed those deadlines and a lot of other bureaucratic obligations. So, because we knew that at this point in time, it's already enough to just try to keep the operative business going. I mean, it would have been the worst case scenario if a whole system would have been limited due to its operative challenges. So partially our help was used, partially we still need further measures. Thank you so much. Okay, I'll talk about the first question. When will be what you just said? So are there already any predictions? So when it comes to allowances and adjustments, because that has to do again with the gradual process, and I think Herr Hufeld was talking about the big end. So we know that at the moment we don't see the entire picture. So what do you think? When will we reach this limit? That is a really difficult prediction because there is one number that we don't know yet, and that's when it comes to the resilience of the businesses. So how long can they hold on? So then you really have to look at the respective businesses, so the hotels, the restaurants, etc. So how long can they hold on? And I mean, that's a precondition to then be able to make a prediction. If they have to fold, then of course and that happens in the first quarter of 2021, that's a different scenario than if they have to fold in this last quarter of 2020. And we also don't know how long this crisis will last. We also don't know how it will develop. So so far, no one could really recover 100% from their losses. So all of these are long-term questions, and the crisis really has a different result for different businesses. So, for example, in some sectors you have actually more sales. And then in other business sectors, you have a lot less sales. So then again, you have to look, for example, maybe you have some local shops, but maybe these already developed their business, so now they also have an online shop, etc. So there you really have to go into detail and look at the situation. And maybe one last thing, because there's a really interesting discrepancy between estimations. So I was mentioning two estimations and our own estimation from different financial institutions. And here you really have significantly you have significant losses, and at the same time this contrasts with what the respective banks tell you when you have a conversation. So for example, the smaller banks in Germany, they say, we know our clients, we know how the situation is, and we actually think that the defaults won't be so high. So there's quite a bit contrast between these two prognoses. So I'm really looking forward to how this will develop. Okay, so once again, I would like to remind our dear public that they can always ask questions. So you can do that via two channels. Okay, maybe now in a European context, we're here at the furniture presentation of Hess in Brussels, and you were already saying that that there will be different developments with the risks and credits. So will there be new tensions within Europe? So will there maybe be one national banking system that will need especially the support of other member states? So will there be new controversies and new tensions? What do you say? Well, I think there really there is a possibility that there will be debates in the future. So it really is a different situation in different member states. But we also had a lot of losses. And Herr Rea said yesterday that, for example, if this trend continues, then we will be back on a level where we had already been. So that would be a level that's not an existential challenge for the system, but still the situation can be very different in different states. So, for example, in a member state where there is a high demand of tourism, that would be, of course, a different situation than if a state is not dependent on that. So then again, that might be an existential challenge. And then once again, we would have a new situation for the banks. That is a situation that we've also already faced in the past. And then, of course, this will be a more complex debate, so also about the health system, development system, etc. And of course, that can have repercussions. Yes, I would like to talk about the long-term perspectives in an instant. So You also talked about these in your keynote. So, but then for now we have a question from a member of the Parliament, of the European Parliament, from Herr Oro, from the Freie Wähler, and he is asking if banking institutions become superfluous when there is a digital euro. Thank you so much for these questions. And of course, that's a very valid question. So, depending on how that digital euro will look like, there is, of course, the risk that people will invest directly in digital euros and will no longer have any bank deposits. Digital euros that are emitted from the ECB are safer than bank deposits. So in earlier times that wasn't possible to have digital euros. You could just collect cash, but I mean that can also be a certain risk. So yes, this idea of digital euros that you then can also change into a different currency is of course a lot more accessible. But at the same time, of course, you also always have risks. But it all depends on the design of this digital version of a euro. Of course, you could also publish the digital euro via the banks. You could have so many other effects. You could have negative interest rates, etc. So depending on these conditions, the prognosis will be different, and the European Parliament had also commented on that. So of course we want to find a way where we limit all the risks. Thank you so much. Yes, you basically built me a bridge to continue with a different subject, which is the perspective for the future. So what do the banks have to do now? So you were saying that Europe is dependent on different sectors, and of course you have the whole deposit sector, bank deposit sector, and of course that's very important. But then there are also others to try in an even more offensive way to have interest rates on a broader basis. So, for example, when it comes to the whole fusion business, is that something that is interesting for everyone in the financial sector, or is that just one strategy of specific institutions? Well, maybe what's interesting here is that when you look at the annual report of 2019, if you look at different reports, which is what we were doing, then you have a very interesting comparison. So the pre-tax results from 2018 and 2019, you have plus 30%. So actually, that is very interesting, because then there are better results, and of course the provisional result is then also higher. when you look at this from an economic point of view, this is a really easy calculation. So it's really about costs and results. And of course, for example, you could just increase the charges, and then if you can no longer increase the charges, you could try to sell. And there's also what banks are trying. At the same time, you can try to save certain expenses, which is also possible through digitalization. And then at the end, it's a mix of all these measures. So that again depends on the market situation, and you then have to evaluate appropriately. And we, as a supervisory institution, then also leave that leeway to the respective institutions, because, of course, you also need to build capital. Okay, if I understand correctly, then here the supervisory institutions should not interfere with the micromanagement of the respective institutions. So what are your expectations about that? Right now, banks are trying out new business models, and at the same time, we have very many new regulating measures, or at least we think there will be a lot in the future. So, what would be your remark to that? Well, maybe first and foremost, I would like to say that within digitalization of the banking sector, there really is a great potential, because when banks have higher data volumes that they can analyze, and when they can do that with intelligent algorithms, and when they can do that live and in real time, then of course this will stabilize the financial system. And especially the European banks need also this liberty to actually use these digital means, not only to still be competitive on an international level, but to just improve. And of course, this is a dilemma, because on the one hand, the banks are slowing down this digitalization, but at the same but we also must ensure that we mitigate the risks. So it's really about balance. There's so much potential as well within digitalization, also for the end users. So then again, we talk about the balance between risk and potential. But here we also have to see in detail how that then is constructed. So, of course, we don't want to have a too burdensome regulation for the banks so that they no longer can move ahead. But at the same time, we need to mitigate the risks. So, of course, this is a balancing act, and that has also been discussed within the working groups in the European Commission, in the Parliament, etc. So we always were trying to reiterate that there needs to be a balance, and I'm also part of the Basel Committee, and the US lost their leading position, and of course then the focus is shifted and the focus is on Europe. So once again, we have to look at the political level when it comes to the future sustainability. And of course, now we have the possibility to have a forerunner position. But if we want to have that position, we also need to find the right balance. Yes, thank you. That's an interesting topic. We have 10 more minutes left, but we also have a lot of questions from our public. So maybe one question from the public, which is about digitalization, from Herr Büchner. So he asks, do you think there will be an acceleration, or how will that work out? How? Well, we saw that during the lockdown, the different bank branches were closed down, and that was between 30 and 80%. But still, they were fully operative, and that was also true for the banking management. So that also showed us that we don't necessarily need so many bank branches, but then of course you also have to think about the clients, the users. But even that can sometimes even optimize their experience. So, of course, there were public statements that were published that said, okay, some branches will reopen, some won't. One experience that we maybe can keep is that everything is possible without bank branches, but maybe not in the way that you would like it to go. So when it then comes to rentability, so everything about pension and business clients, etc., there it really is of utmost importance to actually have the personal meeting face-to-face with the respective client. So I do think that some bank branches will reopen, but then there will still be less. Nonetheless, I think they will continue to exist in the future. Well, thank you so much. Well, you said that in Basel the focus shifts towards Europe. I mean, that can be a compliment. But also from a market perspective, so you were talking about taxonomies and how we could have a forerunner position in that area. And then, of course, there is Brexit, which, I mean, is one of the biggest financial places that breaks away. So when we talk about the internal financial market of Europe, we have a commissioner that also took that into her program. So what are your expectations? What are your demands for an internal financial market in Europe? Well, first and foremost, it was already obvious for the last 2 years that the Brexit will definitely be a hard Brexit for the financial sector. And of course, that is why the banks had prepared themselves for this. For example, in Frankfurt, but also in other cities, you could see that. There is no financial product that you wouldn't be able to get. But maybe in clearing, we said, okay, we can't solve that on a purely European basis, so we will try to have broader decisions. So, of course, this is now a major problem. So once again, I think that London as a financial place is something that won't exist the way it has existed in the future. That is why we need to reinforce our own capacities. And also when it comes to sovereignty, of course, I am talking about financial sovereignty. I think that here we really need to be precise when it comes to terms, because of course we need the access to respective capital markets, and of course this access needs to remain open and that the capital can still move between the different markets. However, if the European financial market is supposed to function as one, then of course we need the support for that, and also we need to digitalize. I think all of these discussions have to be discussions that need to be analyzed when it comes to Brexit, but also when it comes to the US, the market in Hong Kong, etc. So there are so many aspects you need to consider. So there will be a whole new dimension when it comes to financial sovereignty and political weight. So, of course, you can always say something to respective aspects, but it's a complex system. It's not just about competitivity, for example. It's also about functionality, global relevance. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. We will conclude our dialogue here, and I really feel refreshed and have new ideas. So thank you both to your impulses and also what you said about the political level, that we have to maybe move away from traditional reflexes, and maybe now the model really will be renewed and new ways will be taken. And then on the long-term basis, we want to make sure that the banks remain. So maybe one last question. It's a rhetorical question from Dr. Geiser. Do you agree that it doesn't help to call the COVID virus the China virus, as Trump does? So, true. often there are empty words in politics that don't help, but we saw during this crisis that not only words are relevant, but more importantly, actions. And here in the European Union, I think we managed this crisis quite well, and that is also recognized on a global level, both on the European level and the level of the member states. We are strong when it comes to problem solving within the crisis, so we need to use that strength for the future. Thank you so much. There are more and more questions arriving, but unfortunately we have come to the end of our time for today. You said that personal events can't be replaced, so I hope at some point we can see each other in real life. Thank you so much, Professor Wuermeling, for this, and thank you for you moderating it. Thank you to the public. Thank you to the questions. I'm happy to receive more questions via email, and I also really enjoyed being here. Thank you. Great. Thank you. And thank you to our public that you tuned in. And finally, I would like to say that on October 21st, there will be another debate. This will be something completely different because it will be a reading with the winner of the Georg Büchner Prize, Lukas Berfuß. Thank you.